Okay, we're now recording and I'm making you the host.
Okay. So we start then, yeah?
Yes, please. You are now the host.
Okay, so this is the second seminar on mass Weber teaching. The first one was focused upon what we call the subversive Weber, on Weber's stance and Weber subjectivation figure. And today we are going to see the other side of this subversive Weber, which is rather the conservative Weber. So the focus will be a Weberian sociology of domination, Weberian political sociology. And I seek to go through the things that we are very familiar with, the three types of legitimate domination that everybody knows, everybody who studies the social sciences, towards some specifics about Bevers Politics and his prejudices against the people. So we will be moving from what is more familiar to what perhaps is less familiar. So yes, Weberian political sociology. So we take domination so much for granted that we tend to be totally oblivious to the fact that people do not, in principle, desire to be oppressed and dominated. Max Weber did not take domination for granted. He thought that domination, real power or lasting power, had to be and could only be legitimate. Without legitimacy, no domination, no prospects of a power that will last in time. He knew that true power, lasting power or domination rule, lies in attaining, say, some voluntary contribution on the part of the ruled, in getting them to accept or concede acceptance, which de facto becomes submission almost as soon as it happens. For if, according to Weber, legitimate domination rule means simply that the dominated believe that domination is legitimate, yet that belief signals that in reality the subjectivity of the ruled has been conquered, so that their will is orientated, guided, even predisposed towards, in Weber's terms, obedience. And obedience here means genuine obedience, so to say, that is, not calculated obedience out of interest, for example, or fearful obedience out of fear, but say voluntary or willing obedience, even obedience out of duty. This obedience is absolutely needed, to the point that no domination is possible, according to Weber, without this voluntary contribution on the part of the rule. Weber argues that there are very many motives involved in what sustains domination. However, there needs to be at least a little bit of this voluntary obedience. In Weber's own words, a minimum will to obedience, and this is a quote, belongs to every genuine relationship of herrschaft, of rule domination. This is in Economy and Society, Volume 1, Chapter 3, first paragraph, page 2012. And this idea of minimum will to obedience is rendered in the translation into English as voluntary compliance, which is not exactly what Weber says, although in this case is not that bad. But the correct translation is will to obedience. And Weber says very clearly and highlights minimum. So a minimum will to obedience is necessary for domination to be possible. I insist, there are very many motives for a system of power to be able to last in time, to be a form of domination. But at least a minimum will to obedience needs to exist if this form of power is going to last in time. So the dominated have to make some voluntary contribution to their own domination, a voluntary contribution that takes place in the form of obeying from within, say, obeying out of conviction. We cannot emphasize enough that it is obedience which is the absolute key to domination. Otherwise, on the basis of force or violence or power alone, and so without this minimum of obedience, the system of domination is not going to last. In other words, otherwise, without this minimum of obedience, there is no domination, there is no rule, there is no rule domination, which is the best rendering of the German Herrschaft. So otherwise, there is no true rule, but only force or violence and terror. And this is not likely to last. True power is not that stemming from the gun pointing to you. On the contrary, I resort to the gun because and only to the extent that I'm powerless. And what the rulers want is not a corpse, but recognition of their worth, and as a consequence of that, obedience out of that recognition. So true power is that coming from the capacity to be obeyed without resorting to violence. Of course, the gun, force, violence is needed to set the whole system, and then it is also needed in the form of the threat of violence. And yet, this is not enough to have domination, which always requires that will to obey. Now, this voluntary contribution to the dominated, which is the will to obey out of conviction and not out of interest, not out of fear, can take on three main forms. And I'm going to share now some slides with you. So yeah, just 1 second. So you can see there, this is the beginning. We will see others. So there is no mystery about that. So everybody knows that the three legitimate forms of domination: traditional legitimacy, charismatic legitimacy, and rational legal legitimacy. Now, these three legitimate forms of domination are well known, and indeed Weber conceptualized them in very sharp and distinct terms. They can be taken to be paradigmatic examples of what ideal typical conceptualization or ideal types are. Here, I will only refer to the central aspect of each form of legitimate domination to do with the will to obedience or the felt duty to obey. The question to respond is, to what and to whom is obedience out by the dominated? Now, in traditional domination, the traditional type of domination, obedience is owed to the person of the chief who occupies the traditional sanctioned position of authority. Obedience being a matter of loyalty to both the tradition and the person of the chief who incarnates this tradition. In charismatic domination, obedience is owed to the charismatically qualified leader as such, by virtue of personal trust in his revelation, heroism, or exemplary qualities. In rational legal domination, to the legally established impersonal order, an impersonal order to which the authority itself is also meant to be bound. So we have here, and there is no mystery about that because this is very well known, the three standard types of legitimate domination. The first two, traditional and charismatic, involve a very strong personal element. And the last one, which is the one concerning our own times and societies, rational legal domination, it is heavily impersonal. It is meant to be heavily impersonal. Now, those are the three forms of legitimate domination. But then we have a surprise. As in chapter 10 of volume 2 of Economy and Society, entitled Domination and Legitimacy, a very short chapter, we find out that there is a form of domination which is not classed among the legitimate forms, nor is it qualified as illegitimate either. And I'm going to advance here. I have to share again yes, just 1 second. I share again the screen, and you see there economic domination, defined by Weber as domination by virtue of a constellation of interest. This is a form of domination that is diametrically opposed, according to Weber, to domination by virtue of authority or legitimate power. Actually, the first section of this short chapter is entitled Domination by Economic Power and by Authority. Now, while domination by virtue of authority appeals primarily to motives of obedience and duty, economic domination appeals primarily to motives of utility, to interest. The poorest type of economic domination, and this idea of poorest type is a very Weberian kind of concept, it's an ideal typical concept, a pure ideal type. So the purest type of this economic domination, according to Weber, is the market. Weber does not refer to capitalism here, nor does he specify that the market is a capitalist market. I'm going to stop the sharing now. Although his analysis leaves no doubt that such market can only be a capitalist one. Economic domination, as exemplified through the capitalist market, is based on power derived exclusively from the possession of goods, so wealth or market skills. And it is a power unmediated by consent, by will, which, says Weber, quote, might be felt to be much more oppressive than an authority. The question to be posed here is, how can a form of domination, which is not part of the legitimate forms, and in that sense it is not legitimate, last in time, given that what makes domination domination, that is to say lasting power, is precisely what economic domination lacks, namely the mediation provided by the dominated in the form of a minimum consent or will to obedience. So how can this form of domination, which is not part of the legitimate forms, last in time? Weber does not address this problem, but we cannot blame him for that, because after all, this is a completely unfinished part of economy and society, like most of it, actually, but this part is particularly a sketch in reality. And yet, the reason for economic domination to last in time is clear if we take into account other analyses of Weber, the analysis of capitalism, which are obviously those analyses in which, in spite of the Protestant ethics, he is closest to Marx. So the reason for economic domination to last in time, not being a legitimate form of power, is that it is dependent upon and can only exist in the context of a form of legitimate domination. If we are talking about capitalist power, it is dependent upon the rational legal form of domination. In other words, capitalist domination, to the extent that we treat it as an economic form, and this is what Weber does here, is dependent upon the mother state. It needs the state. In Weber's view, capitalist domination is an economic form cannot exist, let alone last in time, without the state. But now another surprise awaits us. If we were surprised to find a form of domination which falls outside the legitimate forms, since it is based on naked, unmediated economic power, well, that was nothing compared to what we are going to see now. We cannot but be dumbfounded to see Weber categorize the self-ruling polity, that is to say, the city-state, the site of the revolutionary invention and reinvention of democracy and citizenship, under the label non-legitimate rule domination, non-legitimate domination, which we find in the last chapter of Economy and Society, Volume 2, entitled The City, and between parentheses, non-legitimate domination, a chapter, a very long chapter, also published as a separate book. And again, now I'm gonna show you, to share the screen to show you the next. So you can see there, non-legitimate domination, the city-state. This is a very odd, a very bizarre category, which would seem to designate that very moment in the struggle against domination when legitimacy is suspended, so that what is emerging is neither as yet legitimate nor any longer illegitimate. And yet, such designation sticks to the necessity of legitimacy and ignores the impulse driving the struggles. Those are the two main features of Weber's bizarre label, the fact that it clings to legitimacy as if it were an absolute necessity, and that it disregards the impulse driving the struggles against domination, as if such impulse were constitutively so sort of breath that it could only last for a passing moment. We see how these two aspects go together and determine one another, considering legitimacy and therefore domination, since legitimacy is what transforms power into lasting power of domination, necessary implies treating the impulse against domination as a momentary reflex lacking breadth. So according to Weber, the Greek polis, the Roman Republic, I'm going to stop sharing now, and the multiple medieval and Renaissance city-states, not to mention the modern revolutionary councils, all these revolutionary sites, yes, these were all revolutionary sites. They might have degenerated later on, sure, nor did they deliver all the promises of emancipation, but they were born out of revolutionary events. So all these sites are for Weber cases of non-legitimate domination, as though the signifier legitimacy had any legitimacy, if I'm allowed that easy pun, had any force or bearing on revolutionary events and constructions which destroy domination and seek to make its future reappearance impossible. A more adequate conceptualization of these revolutionary forms in Weber's own terminology, and this is important to emphasize, in Weber's own terminology would have been, and this is Weber's terminology, alien to domination, Herrschaftsfremde, used by Weber in connection with democracy and rendered as anti-authoritarian in Economy and Society, but that's not a good enough translation of the German term. So alien to domination polities or societies or politics. Alien to domination or indeed non-domination. And again here I have to again insert the screen to show you the next slide, as to say, there you go, non-domination, alien to domination in Weber's terminology, but this is a terminology which is not used by Weber. It's only mentioned a couple of times, but then not used by Weber. We will see. But doing that, so calling it and drawing the implications of this non-domination or alien to domination, this would have implied a radical reconsideration of his entire framework. In effect, this would be what we might call the purest type of legitimacy, the one that dissolves legitimacy as an extrinsic justification, because instead of a belief in and a recognition of the legitimacy of existing rule domination, it is a direct affirmation of non-rule or alien to domination politics on the part of the ruled or dominated. So you can see now I have moved to another slide. Self-rule or non-rule or real democracy requires no extrinsic justification. It therefore automatically dissolves legitimacy. Indeed, it is precisely this non-rule or non-domination and the impulse behind it what lurks underneath any form of legitimate domination like a ghostly presence, and what haunts Weber's sociology of domination, based as it is on the fundamental insight that all forms of domination depend on a minimum will to obedience and not on violence or coercion alone. For this will implies another will, the will to disobedience as a permanent possibility, or to put it in Machiavelli's much more opposite faction, the desire neither to be ruled nor oppressed, which is the people's desire in Machiavelli's understanding and praxis of politics. Let me go back again to the normal However, this cannot be theorized in a framework like Weber's, which gives absolute priority to the desire to dominate and oppress, ignores the opposite desire not to be oppressed and dominated, and considers relationships and structures of domination as the only one existing on a solid and stable basis. This neglect makes it impossible for Weber to treat theoretically the desire challenging domination and the political forms it manages to create. Thus, radical forms of conflict, those challenging the very existence of domination, or at least striving, in Weber's own expression, and this is a quote, to minimize the domination of men over men, can only be considered as anomalies and treated as something added on or as a supplement to his theory. And this is what Weber was compelled to do, particularly in his unfinished essay on the city-state, the last chapter of Economy and Society, entitled, as I say, The City, Non-Legitimate Domination, and published as a separate book, which focuses on the commune or die Gemeinde as a self-ruling polity, that is to say, precisely on the struggles and institutional forms, above all the plebeian city, which embody the questioning of domination and the affirmation of non-rule, anarchy, or non-domination, that is, real democracy, which can be understood as the affirmation of non-rule or as the identity and regular interchangeability between rulers and ruled. Identity, which is another way of removing domination from the polity. Now, as said, Weber was haunted by this problem, by the impossibility of his sociology of domination to treat theoretically emancipatory forms of politics, that is, politics which deny domination and beyond that, affirm non-domination. That this is so, and that Weber's thought dwelled on these ideas, is manifest in his attempt at a fourth idea of legitimacy. And again, here I have to go. We'll finish in a moment with these slides. I have to go to the next slide, yes, to show to you. So you can see there, we go, a fourth type of legitimate domination. So yes, he named it a fourth idea of legitimacy. He named it like that in 1917 for the first and only time, according to Edith Hanke, who is one of the editors of the complete work of Weber's complete works in German. We know of two of these attempts at the fourth type of legitimate domination. We know of two of them. The first one still falls entirely within the bounds of Weber's framework, if at the price of some twisting, since it is based on the will of the ruled. We are still within the narrow confines of legitimacy, where the will to obedience is absolutely necessary. Weber has told us to make domination possible. Such will to obedience is indisputably the will of the ruled, but what we have now is a vague or intransitive will of the rule. For what kind of will can this be other than the will to be not ruled, not dominated, not oppressed? However, this will to be not oppressed nor dominated is a will Weber's sociology of domination cannot allow. Indeed, Weber could only make a space for such will by radically transforming his sociology of domination. The second attempt at a fourth type of legitimate domination, or as he said in 2017, a fourth idea of legitimacy, we know of, is a more adequate candidate in that it finally does not take the categories of rule and rulers, or dominated and dominant, as a given, although it still falls within the tripartite framework of legitimate types of domination. It is the sovereignty of the people, which 1 year later, in 1918, Weber considered the foundation, quote, of the revolutionary natural rights legitimacy of the Constituent Assembly. It is by no means clear that this sovereignty of the people is still dependent on some form of legitimacy implies in relation to non-domination. So it is not clear what this sovereignty implies in relation to non-domination. Let me move to the last slide. What is clear here is that Weber continues to refuse to recognize that self-rule or non-rule or real democracy requires no extrinsic justification, and therefore automatically dissolves legitimacy. Indeed, the Revolutionary Constituent Assembly Weber refers to does not require legitimacy, or if it does, it will only be for some external observer. The name of this external observer or standpoint is, as we know, political philosophy, supposed to occupy the decided position which determines and judges the validity of political regimes and demands legitimacy from them. Weber clearly fell into this trap of the external observer, or the supposed higher authority of political philosophy. The point to be stressed in this connection is that these attempts by Weber at a fourth type of legitimacy show not only that Weber had full awareness of the limitations of his theorization, but that the antithesis of domination was Weber's real. That is to say, the denied reality in the theory, which always returns as a specter to haunt its denier. Indeed, alien to domination politics, to use Weber's own idle terminology, idle because he does not use it, and the political forms it produces exceed Weber's political sociology and destabilize his view of rule domination as an absolute inevitable fate. All such politics are inscribed into a permanent, if not always manifest, undercurrent of antagonistic desire involving rather different figures of the people. Demons, plebs, and popolo are the best known ones, constituted out of those initially excluded from the polity and then, once they became a people thanks to a struggle, included. Nay, included out as counterpowers rather than parallel powers. This is particularly the case of the plebs in the Roman Republic, materialized through institutions like the assembly, concilium, and the tribunes of the plebs, the capitani del popolo, and, to Weber's horror, popular courts. Weber's view of these alternative political arrangements and their carriers is negative and one-sided. He seemingly considers such counterpowers as forms of anarchy, non-rule, or as tyranny, an ephemeral, so not adequate to constitute the human order, or at least to contribute to its constitution. Yet, even if many of them lost their insurgent character fairly soon and became part of the established forms of domination, it is in this process of degeneration that Weber concentrates all his analytical power. Nevertheless, they definitely contributed in a historical significant fashion to making manifest possible emancipatory or alien to domination, to once again use Weber's idle expression, politics and political forms. Above all, they testify to a universal emancipatory impulse, which Weber dismisses as wholly delusory, while he belittles the different figures of the people who are its carriers. We thus stumble upon the people, a complex and difficult to conceptualize notion, but one that is political through and through. The irony is that this political character is something that all too often is owned by the constant efforts made to depoliticize it. What is remarkable in that respect is Weber's profound distrust and disparaging observations of the people, particularly in its active figures. This is something patently explicit in his political writings, but is by no means confined to these writings and to what we can call Bevers Politics. It is something theorized in his sociology of domination, particularly in relation to charisma. Thus, in Economy and Society, Weber argues that the charismatic belief or idea upon which charisma rests, quote, revolutionizes men from the inside out. It involves, this charismatic belief of idea, a being seized by the idea, which enforces the inner suggestion to it, end quote. It is in this sense that Weber argues, quote, charisma is indeed the specifically creative revolutionary force of history. But this concerns only creators or charismatic leaders and partly the close followers, not the rule or led. The rule or led is Weber's expression there in this part of Economy and Society we're looking at now. The way in which the latter, so the ruled or led, quote, inwardly appropriate and experience the idea is radically different, as it takes place once the process of rationalization of charisma sets in, and, says Weber, from without. Rationalization, let us add, is the most frequent avenue of the routinization of charisma. Routinization is discretion on the everyday, and the everyday can well be considered as, after all, the strongest power. Quote, the broad masses of the led merely adopt or adapt themselves to the external technical resultants, whereas the substance of the creator's ideas remain irrelevant to them, end quote. The question this ideal typical account of charisma raises is, first of all, about the historical adequacy of Weber's understanding of the masses' relation to charisma. For, as we have seen, Weber's account does by no means exhaust the historical truth, as the events of democracy proper and the invention of citizenship in the revolutionary side, that is the ruling polity, so. Indeed, such partial historical account strongly suggests a substantive view about the people on Weber's part that is prior to any historical account and shaping any such account. A substantive view concerning the people's capacity, or rather lack thereof, for subjectivation, for devotion to an idea or to a value as opposed to personal devotion or personal devotion to a leader or mere external adaptation. This reveals that Weber's disparaging reflections on the people and in his political writings are not simply the fruit of the grave situation of Germany at the time. We are talking about the Great War, World War I, but a deeply ingrained thought and attitude. The people for Weber are simply the politically inexistent, or if they gain existence as active mass or multitude, which for Weber basically means the politics or the rule of the street, he says, then it is, quote, wholly rational and incapable of thought, or, quote, thinks only as far as the day after tomorrow. Hence, the people are, by definition, destined to be ruled, dominated, even an active people or fraction thereof. For instance, the native industrial proletariat, an important object of concern and in part of admiration for Weber. The major virtue of this mighty industrial proletariat, according to Weber, lies in being, quote, capable of being ordered and orderly led by politicians who think rationally, end quote. Only the desire to dominate is susceptible to rationality, whereas the desire not to be dominated nor oppressed is debased as irrational and neglected in every form. This incontestably so that Weber's view about the people reproduce, ironically and embarrassingly, for a social scientist, let alone for a thinker of Weber's stature, every ruler's claim. So that's Weber's reproducing every ruler's claim. Not only is this an extremely prejudiced view, but it is biased in a very specific direction. Prejudice and bias, which undoubtedly impaired Weber's ambition to provide a wholly new political theory and new political sociology. It is thus evident that Weber did not want to take on that hard province, as Machiavelli depicts, the task of defending a people who has political existence, quote from Machiavelli again, against the common opinion, says Machiavelli. That is, against the accustomed anti-popular opinio doctorum. For that people, that is to say, a people who exist politically, Machiavelli declares, has been accused by all the writers, end quote. And it is this path, the oldest and most trodden one among intellectuals, that Weber, after Machiavelli, after Marx, followed, which is an altogether different matter in a thinker who had proudly claimed to, quote, consider nothing human as alien, end quote, and whose sociology of domination was meant to bring about a decisive break with the classics, or rather a decisive break with the usual intellectual garbage in favor of the powers that be. It is perhaps worth recalling that in his inaugural address, when he was appointed professor of political economy, Weber expressed his full contempt for all those, indeed a majority, he implied, of academics and intellectuals who align themselves with existing or the rising powers, he said. That Weber remained stuck in that oldest and most trodden of paths is to be regretted. For after all, he had all the necessary elements to undertake a proper comparison and avoid the deficient judgments he made. As to the comparative approach, he had Machiavelli's chapter, from which we have just quoted. It's from the Machiavelli Discourses, Book 1, Chapter 58, from which we have just quoted, a test imperative for any open-minded attitude. Machiavelli's framework for comparing the two antagonists, a people who has political existence and a prince in reality meaning an oligarchy, is an extremely elegant and parsimonious one which forbids what methodologically goes without saying, but the worst and most successful demagogy has endlessly repeated to devastating effect, to wit, comparing the antagonist under different conditions so as to ensure a permanent yield against the people, while systematically avoiding the most frequent condition of princes, that of being, in Machiavelli's terms, unshackled from the laws, in Machiavelli's formulation. Laws meaning also principles and norms. Yet, it is precisely this condition of being bound by no principle or norm and having total contempt for and absolute impunity before the law what defines oligarchic domination, as we can to our sorrow testify these days to an even greater extent than Machiavelli and Weber did in theirs. This as far as the comparative approach goes. Now, as to the empirical evidence to undertake the comparison, Weber himself provides it, for he does not recoil, even under wartime censorship, from targeting several times two groups in Germany, which we are talking about during the period of the First World War, from targeting several times two groups in Germany, which separately or jointly constitute a paradigmatic case of Machiavelli's crazy, wicked prince, crazy, wicked Passo and Cattivo, who is bound by no principles or laws and, in Machiavelli's terms, can do what he wants. That is, of an oligarchy, as the plutocracy is usually called. Firstly, the monarch and his entourage, ministers, politicians, and the military supreme command, who, according to Weber, govern on the basis of, and I summarize here Weber's point, purely personal elements, do crazy things, and are subject, like the masses, to irrational influences, albeit the masses' quote, emotional qualities are nothing like as dangerous as those of monarchs, states Weber. Secondly, the plutocracy, as Weber calls it, all anew, which grew richer from war profiting, thus confirming, if need be, that a plutocracy is always a kleptocracy, and was busy maneuvering to ennoble war profits by entailing German soil handed over to it, this is a quote, behind the backs of the fighting army, end quote. That's the ultimate affront for Weber. Weber emphasizes the plutocrat's vanity, a boundless vanity. As to the people, no similarities with this group appear, rather the starkest of contrast, as the masses, in what is undoubtedly one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century, had been carried away by the nationalistic wave from the beginning of the war, and so the soldiers continued to shed their blood in the front while all that profiting and maneuvering was being done at home. Now, Weber is adamant that a people who exist politically must be ruled and dominated, but he maintains a deadly silence about the mad prince, the oligarchy, that is to say, the plutocracy, kleptocracy. Perhaps the reason for this deadly silence lies in his unwarranted, if time-honored, but profoundly anti-Machiavellian confidence in wealth, that is to say, in, Weber says, men of property, whose wealth provides them vis-a-vis the emotionality of the propertyless masses who must struggle daily for existence, all this is a quote, it not with the full economic qualification for politics or ruling, which according to Weber is the preserve of the grand rentier, this is quite astonishing, then at least a degree thereof of this qualification for ruling. Full qualification for ruling is only in the hands of the grand rentier, but the wealthy people can also have good qualifications for ruling. Their wealth enables such men some, quote, inner availability, distance from the immediate conflicts of interest, end quote, so that they find it easier to maintain, quote, a cooler head and cheaper to show political character and cool reflection, end quote. This is an astonishing judgment by a man who strove to look reality in its stern face. We have thought that distance, authentic distance, was not the calm contemplation of the disengaged or unconcerned, but had to be gained, say, in the midst of the fray and holding on to the tensions. Something serious must be our fault when Weber is led to the realm of what Machiavelli famously called imagined republics and principalities, the only ones in which men or property do not sooner rather than later seek more property, not fear to lose it, nor decree any obstacle against further acquisition as tyranny. In actual politics, in actual societies, things are different. Here, Weber himself reminds us of, quote, the familiar and usual fear of the property classes. And his wealthy men gains on reality, quote, to the man of wealth, concerned with the economic security of his existence is, consciously or unconsciously, a cardinal point in his whole orientation of life, end quote. In actual societies, men of wealth quickly become, unless prevented by a political force, mad princes who, as Machiavelli argues, but also Plato, and as everyone can see today, respect no law and attend to no reason. Hence, Machiavelli's strict consistency in drawing the logical conclusion about the drastic and only remedy for a crazy, wicked prince. Let us remind ourselves of the only remedy for a crazy prince, for an oligarchy, il ferro, the iron. But Weber thought otherwise. He seems much more in line with the long-established tradition, indeed, with that tried proverb in Machiavelli's apt designation in the prince, that tried proverb, and we continue the quote from Machiavelli, that he who founds on the people founds on mad. If so, it is ultimately on mad that Weber founded his plebiscitary Reich president, even if the masses are only called to elect the charismatic leader, and this is all they are asked to do, who then will do as he pleases. But in truth, the feeble grounds of Weber's plebiscitary leader lie, first of all, in the fact that, in an ironical twist that cannot be found in Weber's political sociology, charisma is at the service of conservation, not of transformation. Secondly, and accordingly, the people's election and support of the leader is based on personal devotion rather than on a substantive political project. Weber's charismatic prince, to call it like that, is thus almost the perfect antithesis of Machiavelli's new prince, also obviously commented and reflected upon by Gramsci, an emancipatory project of liberation involving a revolutionary alliance with the people against the oligarchy. But Weber did not believe in any such emancipatory project, that is to say, a project for a free way of life, in Machiavelli's expression, or, resorting to Weber's terms, an alien to domination way of life. He didn't exactly think that men are wicked by nature, but he was convinced that in politics, one has to presuppose them to be so. once again in continuity with an age-old tradition that has justified domination on such inconsistent assumption. Accordingly, he was categorical that, I quote, anyone with a sense of responsibility has no right, as Fichte rightly said, to assume goodness and perfection in human beings, end quote. This is certainly true, but Weber forgot to add, nor does one have the right to discard them altogether. It is the tense conjunction of both statements, assuming goodness and assuming the opposite, what truly captures Machiavelli's thought and what will accord with Weber's fundamental stance. That is, as we saw in the first seminar on Weber's thought, with that figure of subjectivation joining together in bare subjectivity, a demon or ultimate value, and the attempt to make it alive in the world. Weber's half-truth is, as is the case of half-truths, more damaging than blatant lies. And it is by no means Machiavelli's view, contrary to what Weber suggests by referring to Fichte's influential essay on Machiavelli. Rather, it is the distorted interpretation of Machiavelli promoted by the European oligarchies, which goes under the name of Machiavellism. But it is also contrary, in my view, to Weber's own philosophical thought at its best, for human beings are also reality. Therefore, they will have the fundamental features that reality has, according for Weber. So they are inexhaustible in both their wickedness and their possibilities for goodness. Only out of sheer prejudice can one discard the latter and thereby, willingly or not, foreclose the ways to it. This is it. Thank you. Cannot hear.
Yeah, thank you so much, as usual. Great 1 hour, very concrete presentation. Maybe Peter wants to open up with a question, and I see Josh maybe had to go do duties for the lady of the house anyway. So, but let's begin with Peter then, yeah, because Peter knows Weber very well, and yeah, and the
no, I mean, not like Carlos, but I think is a very important question. You know, the limits of this model of domination, and what it means in terms of the possibilities for a democracy or for a non-servile forms of politics. But I think one problem in going from the three forms of legitimate, the three ideal types, you know, charismatic, traditional, legal, rational, to then include the fourth, is the unit of analysis. Because in Weber, domination by definition is a command-obey relationship, and a command-obey relationship that is focused on individuals fundamentally. You know, individual obedience. You know, why person X obey the command, let's say, why the child obey the parents, while the citizens obey the police officer, whatever the case may be. And when you get to the question of democracy and the city-state and the people, let's say, then we have a problem, because to the degree that it's self-rule, is it the self-rule of the community or of the individual? Because, you know, in Aristotle's formulation, for example, the citizen rules and is ruled in turn. So in that, so the community by default is autonomous, is self-ruled, but the individual at times is rules and is ruled, as Aristotle says. So I think we have a problem, not just of the limits of non-domination or non-obedience, but also we have to make it more dialectical, the analysis, because with Weber it's very focused on the individual, without understanding how the individual can be more than one thing, let's say at the same time, you know, part of the, someone who's ruled and is ruled, part of the autonomous community, and at times someone maybe whom political authority will be, or political power will be ruled over. One. Two, when it comes to the economic domination as a fourth, neither legitimate nor illegitimate. One question I always had was the following: if legal rational authority is characterized by instrumental calculation, the person who obeys or doesn't obey calculates costs and benefits and makes a decision, it's in my best interest to obey, or it's in my best interest not to obey. How is that different from market rationality? Because in both cases, don't we have instrumental reason as the dominant form of subjectivity, let's say?
But no, Peter, but in Weber's understanding, the will to obey is not instrumental. This minimum will to obedience that Weber refers to, yes, there will be this instrumental that you say it will be important, and other motives always. But unless, he says, there is this minimum will to obedience, and this will to obedience being not obedience out of interest, not obedience out of fears, but let's say out of conviction, out of duty, unless this is there, even in a minimum way, then the system of domination will tend to fall apart. It's not, it doesn't have prospects of lasting. So the power will not be domination, lasting power. So yes.
But if, you know, again, from what I remember, each ideal type of domination is distinguished by the virtue of why someone obeys. Do they obey? Why someone might obey? Do they obey out of habit? Do they obey out of an effectual response to the person issuing the command? Or do they obey out of rational calculation? Now, if the rational calculation, again, you know, it seems to me that the logic of the market domination and the logic of legal rational authority is the same. Even what may be different, though, is that in the market, it's not only impersonal, there's no direct command given to obey necessarily. You know,
there is no mediation. I explain it as like in this mediation of the will to obey, but not out of instrumental reasons. This minimum will to obey out of conviction, let's say, out of duty, because the system is legitimate. This is, and I have to, you know, at least, of course, I calculate my interests, etc., and might have several motives. Weber insists on that, on the variety of reasons, motives, and causes. But he says, unless there is this minimum will, so in that sense, it's very different from the market rationality. Precisely the economic domination, which is what comes in what I explained after the three legitimate forms, it is characterized by this naked form of power. Naked because it's, you know, without the mediation of the dominated, in the sense, okay, I obey willingly because you are legitimate authority and you can command legitimately. So in this sense, it's very different. Now that there is an affinity between rational legal domination and the market form of power or domination, of course, very strong. But yeah.
Okay.
But I stopped your reasoning, so I don't know. You were making a full argument.
No, I mean, this was simply it. I mean, to me, the way I always understood the question of the market versus domination was that with the market, we are no longer in a command-obey relationship, but these are relation of coercion. Is power rather than but not domination. Yes, yeah. This was that's how I always had understood it. That here we have, was it basically threatening people with starvation or with, you know, homelessness or whatever. Is beyond the command-obey relationship. Now we have is like a gun, you know, the market, in a sense.
What is interesting, therefore, I think, is to see how is it possible, this economic domination, which is naked economic power, and it is possible, according to Weber, I will say, even though he doesn't say this explicitly, provided it takes place within the modern state or within the legal, within a legitimate form, which for us is the legal rational. Yeah. But then there is the other, what he calls the non-legitimate domination, the city-state, or the revolutionary sides, which is quite astonishing.
Even there, you have command-obey relationships, but it's not. Again, I think is a question of being able to think about it dialectically. Who is giving the command in a sense? You know what I mean? Because, for example,
what do you mean dialectically, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, again, I want to just emphasize the relationship of Nietzsche to Weber here.
Yes,
You begin to see this in the second essay, in particular, of Nietzsche's genealogy of morals. Who is commanding, who is obeying? And he goes through this very, very much in terms of how the opposition of good and bad, good and evil is created in history, right? It's a very interesting, both philological and I think material analysis of how we get this opposition language throughout history of noble to base, master slave, all of these things. And I think that Weber is very much influenced by this, and
yes,
dialogue.
yes.
Yeah.
He was, yes, you are totally right, yeah. He was very influenced by Nietzsche, but particularly by this essay in the genealogy of morals.
Right, and also,
yes, this is known, yeah.
Right, and then you bring up the Herrschaften. I mean, in Nietzsche, it's Herrschaften. The dialectic of history, or the movement of history, is between master formations, which Nietzsche would call Herrschaften, right, or structures of domination, and Bildung, which is basically cultural image and cultural formations, which is interesting too. How does this culture then become in this relationship to mastery or to command and obey structures that Peter is pointing out?
Yeah, but the question is, Michael, within Weber's model, within those pure types,
right,
how can you conceive of autonomy, of self-rule?
Right.
You see what I mean? Because
well, I think Carlos
you have to go outside of individual command-obey relationships.
Right, I understand that, but I think Carlos in his subversive Weber was pointing to that a little bit in terms of subjectivity, a little bit, and where he began today about the will to obedience, the will that he said was falsely translated as the will to comply, right? This then becomes the question of the will again, and what is the relationship of the will to autonomy here? I mean, in Nietzsche's obviously describing in The Will to Power his notebooks towards his own political philosophy, the will, as a collective formation, right? And these wills to power, etc. I mean, I think you're really on to something here, Carlos, in a good sense for Weber studies, because most people will continue to think of Weber in relation to Marx and not so much in Nietzsche and the politics. And they both, as you were saying, that somehow Weber lands on the side of the oligarchs, right? Or on the sides of
absolutely,
right, which is interesting, which is exactly what happens with Nietzsche, despite all the attempts to democratize him, especially out of the American scholars, in the 80s. 90s, and so I think there's something very interesting here in that dialogue just as much. I'm not trying to get away from what Peter said. I understand very well, but I think this relationship needs to be pointed out. But I mean, I want to hear. Yeah, I mean, this is good. I'd like to hear more about Peter. Leska, did you want Leska?
Yeah. Can I? It's just I'm thinking of something. What's the relation between legitimacy and violence? Because the discussion kind of reminds me of Carl Schmitt's whole idea, and Walter Benjamin in here, of that law setting and law breaking violence. And I wonder if you can, or the legitimacy of non-legitimacy, so to speak, that perhaps why Weber did that, call that non-legitimate, is there this absence of this law creating violence? Maybe I'm just thinking that it's throwing I guess.
Yeah,
Is there a possibility?
yeah.
Because
You're thinking about also Benjamin. You know.
Yeah.
Creating the. No, I mean in Weber the relation. I mean legitimacy is what makes domination possible. Domination as lasting power or power lasting in time, because violence is not sufficient. It's necessary to set the system in place and then as a threat. But it's not unless there is this legitimacy, as Weber understands it, which ultimately comes to this will to obey, at least in part, out of conviction that you have to obey because what exists is legitimacy, or the powers in place are legitimacy. So legitimacy is what goes outside and beyond precisely violence. Is what allows for.
I guess my way of thinking is that would it be possible if you consider legitimacy as perhaps violence turned into positivity, as Hegel would say when early Hegel, and he's talking about Christianity, it's that kind of objectified or kind of violence. So I think Weber was able to consider legitimacy or the status quo as some form of violence, even though he trying to not think of it like that. I think we can read it in him in that way.
Yeah, if you look at it at how it emerges historically, I think it emerges from violence. So there is, in the end, is submission, and this submission, the only basis of it is violence and wealth, but wealth is based upon violence itself. So Weber doesn't enter much into this, but at the beginning of my presentation, I was referring to that ultimately this thing is that the rule or the dominated they had been conquered. The subjectivity has been conquered to the point that they accept or consent to this form of power, so that we don't need to spend so much resources in having the guns out all the time and all the armies and everything. If people obey willingly out of conviction, then, and this is, according to Weber, what allows for systems of domination to exist, or lasting power lasting in time. So yes.
Sorry,
Sorry.
it's very interesting.
No,
I missed the first lecture. I'm sorry, but you're kind of making me think about maybe the progression from violence to legitimation of violence is essentially this movement of politics in industrial capitalist society. The violent moment is the initial moment. It's almost like the Hegel master-slave dialectic. And as I understand what you're saying, and what Lexa is, I think, pointing our attention to as well, is that the violent moment is always there. That's just inevitable in any kind of extremely violent, extremely exploitative society like capitalism. So the notion of legitimacy mediates the generalization of violence into politics. So in other words, the violent act, whether it's the primary, accumulation of capital, like I'm in Bulgaria now, so I witness to this day the violent primary originary accumulation of capital in Bulgaria since 1989, and the violence is just now starting to become legitimized, right? So now people are starting to acquire the language of, well, he drives a Bentley and he is rich because he's one of the oligarchs, and well, it's not right, but he is, so I'm going to go along with, this kind of thinking. And it seems like that's a very important idea in terms of the mediation, like the word mediation here, in terms of how violence in its kind of short-term tactical use as the initial stage of projection of power in struggle becomes winning, like it wins. It wins when it is able to transform into a mediator of different social energies, something like that.
It's absolutely so, yes. And actually, I'm going to put in the chat a quote from Rousseau. We were talking about Nietzsche, which had a strong influence on Weber, but also particularly regarding politics and relations of power. Rousseau, I'm going to send the quote to you by post. This is, and It talks about what you are referring to. The stronger is never strong enough to be forever master unless he transforms his force into right and obedience into duty. So obedience, for example, out of fear or out of, into duty. So if you obey out of your inner will, then you don't need a gun pointing to you. And Rousseau is well known, had a lot of influence on Weber. I think Weber studied Rousseau quite thoroughly, probably. And this quote, which sometimes I use with the students to set the problem. So how you because the problem is that how to transform force, violence into right. And in this case, into inner obedience in Weber's terminology, or obedience out of duty in Rousseau's terminology. So
and
yes.
From the point of view of anti-capitalist struggle, then we have to go the reverse route in order to get to the originary violence, which then will renew the cycle, if you will, of the new kind of legitimate social order that is what we want, we imagine it to be. I mean, in other words, this kind of sets up, to my mind at least, how difficult anti-capitalist struggle is at this point. Let's say in the United States, forget it, or like in other parts of the world, because how do you snap out of the legitimation mode, or in Gramsci's word, how do you do counter hegemony, or how do you puncture this ideological space that permeates everyday life, to get to the originary violence with which to essentially create enough instability in the routine functioning of legitimated power relations to get to the point of revolutionary transformation as even a possibility, and then survive long enough to to get to the other side.
Yeah,
I find that very helpful, though, your analysis. I find like it kind of legitimates almost like the entire revolutionary tradition of the 20th century in general, even though perhaps it has lost right now temporarily.
Yeah. I think if we want to go further in depth into this, I don't mean now today, but we have to go to, as Lexa suggested, to Benjamin,
Yeah.
To Benjamin, the critique of violence, this which is perhaps the most commented essay on violence ever, but it has there some insights rather than fully developed analysis, and yeah, I mean, so legitimacy is the work of violence. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I mean, you certainly have long reflections by Georges Sorel on violence too, right?
Yeah.
And of course, Marx never said anything about the peaceful overthrow of capitalism. He uses the word violent. This is always, the revolution is always a violent, overthrow. So the word violence, and of course, Frantz Fanon and the great meditation in the first chapter of The Wretched of the Earth is a long meditation on violence, and remember, violence, going back to what Lexa said, the Benjamin's name, Gewalten, Walter, is part of force and violence in the German language. So there's a play.
I mean, there's also Nietzsche. Is it Kraft or is it Walten, Gewalt? I mean, you can also put Nietzsche there.
Yeah, sure, of course. No, I understand that. Yeah.
But Weber does say the state claims a monopoly of the legitimate use of violence.
Right.
So it's not that violence is concurrent with legitimate power, but there is a legitimate and illegitimate use of violence potentially, and the state claims a monopoly of the one over the rest of the society.
Yeah.
So that's the problem that the left faces. From the standpoint of society as such, it would be an illegitimate use of violence.
Well, but from the left, we have to undo from the very beginning these categories, because from the left we talk about only violence as insurrectionary or defensive violence, which is
a kind of creative violence to create the new out of the old.
Yeah, perhaps.
I mean, that's the Benjaminian, right? There's just two kinds of violence, that that defends the old laws and the one violence to create the new laws.
Well, the divine violence is the revolutionary violence.
Right, right, the creating the new.
Transcendent violence. Yeah, yeah. He sets that up. Yeah. Critique. Yeah. I was going to go back to this notion of charisma that you were talking about as well. I mean, do you see that working on both right and left? This notion that he has. I mean, you really think about this. The left has its icons, right? We're very charismatically attracted to the Lenins of the world who took the risk, the leadership, to transpose onto that. Charismatic as hero, right? Charismatic, not who builds institution, but the charismatic hero in Weber, and of course Fidel and Che, who were very charismatic figures. They're, in one case very short and then long life. Mao Zedong, and of course in China in the beginning, etc. What do you see the role of charisma at this point in terms of the left here? Since you said it was, one of the forms of dominant, one of the three forms that you mentioned, of course, in the traditional Weberian.
Yeah.
So yeah, how?
I mean, this is something
yeah, please. And
Yeah.
Trump.
No, this is something we could have developed, but it will require, I try to contradict Weber or supplement Weber through two ideas of charisma. One, collective charisma, and two, the charisma of the idea, the charisma of the principles, which could be, I don't know how Weber didn't develop this, because he developed a lot about the idea of conviction, the idea of vocation, calling, on these things. So I will use these two ideas that Weber doesn't develop, the collective charisma and the charisma of the idea. But the charisma of the idea ultimately is the loyalty to the principles, loyalty to the truths.
Yeah.
It will be ultimately Badiou's idea of truth somehow.
Right. And the relationship.
Carlos, that might be closer to his notion of substantive rationality than it is to charismatic authority.
Well, yes, yes, absolutely, yes, yeah.
But yeah, going back to this, I mean, this whole notion of the charisma of the idea, Weber is very much taken by the Old Testament prophets, right? And in terms of a vocational charisma, in a sense, does that still have a relevance for us? Again, and one school of Marxism has an idea of the messianic conceptions of history. This is Benjamin. This is Ernst Bloch. This is many, many people. Utopia itself is a messianic, conception, if you will, right? So
yeah, but
yeah,
I don't know, Michael. My impression is that the left doesn't know what to do with Benjamin.
yeah, okay.
It doesn't stop.
I mean, yeah,
it doesn't stop commenting it and having very interesting, truly interesting. And I myself, I'm very interested in Benjamin. But this, I don't know. Yeah, I think that these ideas ultimately lead to some kind of fleeing from the wall, ultimately.
Okay.
Talking in Weberian terms.
Right. Yeah.
Wall fleeing or, but I don't know. Yeah. So, but what you pose is a very difficult issue. I don't know.
Right. No, I understand. I mean, but it's a great term. Yeah. We have it on the right. We have a different kind of charisma with a Donald Trump. And certainly in Germany, the charisma of the Third Reich, if you will, and it's leader, and we had this in fascist governments. Look how long Franco stayed in power in your country. I mean, he's a case study, right, of this in many ways.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, like Louis Buñuel saying at the end of his life, Franco saved the Jews. So I mean, yeah. So.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, just a thought about since you brought it up. I like the way you do the two types, the collective and the charisma of idea. And it seems like one weapon, that the left does have is the charisma of idea to kind of, work with that in a different way. How do you get out there and change not only the language, but the material force that language was built on, by undoing the regime. of thinking, etc.
Yeah, because for the left, as the idea, I mean, the relations between people is the questions of brotherhood and sisterhood.
Right.
This, in my understanding, excludes a charismatic relationship of the Weberian kind based on personal charisma.
Absolutely.
So it will be based, and Weber himself develops the idea, but people tend to forget that, talks about the idea, the charismatic idea, as I did in the quote, which is fine, is embodied or incarnated by an exceptional individual or supposed to be exceptional.
Right.
But for the left, is the egalitarian relations.
Right.
Exclude this kind of personal devotion to
Yeah.
So the relations between people will be the brothers and sisters, let's say, but not the kind of subordinate followers of the charismatic leader.
Interesting.
And I think this is something that is difficult to put in practice, because without charismatic leaders, we are supposed to obey sometimes some leaders if you are in a union or you are in a political party. And
well, I mean, I think it raises the problem that somehow the Occupied movement, right, et cetera, they brought up, Mike Check and all of this, the leaderless, radical.
But this is problematic as well.
Very problematic, today.
Yeah. I mean, in that sense, the Machiavellian approach involves both aspects.
Yes.
So it involves an active people and an active prince, which is normally a collective.
Right.
But this can change. I think that, Machiavelli can be made through Marx, and others can be made more, how can we put it? Yeah, more contemporary. Why not? More contemporary. But the idea of some kind of direction is, in Machiavelli's understanding, is needed. This can change. It can change.
Right.
In time, it needs not be always the same people, but yeah. But the question of charisma is extremely problematic, and but Weber's developments on charisma, I think they are quite astonishing. They are quite extraordinary, but they are limited from this other point of view that we were talking about as well. Yeah.
I mean, I have another.
So
please go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to emphasize the extent to which is quite astonishing. Weber stands on the side of the oligarchy ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I was going to ask that question. What do you see here as someone who's studied this for a very long time, and as a, I guess we could say also a sociologist of power, right? And understanding power and power relations. Why do you see figures such as a Weber, go the way of the ruler, right, so to speak? What do you see this tendency that reacts to this? And obviously Nietzsche, gets sick over the Paris Commune, who never had a relationship to the French Revolution. But what do you see here in terms of the fear,
where?
In Weber's thinking, his change, his inability to go the way of the Social Democratic Party, or then ultimately, of course, the Bolsheviks, et cetera. Where do you see the failure there for one of the most brilliant, 19th century, early 20th century minds who is studying power, studying historically, et cetera? Why is the taking of the side done on the hand of the quote, either oligarchs or the rulers at that point? I mean, we have this tendency in history. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
No, I think in Weber this is permanent. Sometimes might be more or less manifest, but I think it's permanent. Okay. It is interesting because he himself criticizes Nietzsche's what he considers excessive elitism. And Weber refers in his political writings to Nietzsche in a critical way. I don't remember exactly the quote, but he refers to these ideas of despising the all too many, and the all too many is a Nietzschean very typical expression. And Weber says that relying on that is, is like having the need to use crutches, which are, undignified or a thinker, and
Right.
But he does the same ultimately.
Yes.
He does the same.
That's sort of my
Yeah,
question.
I mean, what he says about the people is quite astonishing, and
Yeah, you did.
I try to convey that.
Yeah. I mean, you have this
yeah.
Ortega y Gasset, the Spanish philosopher, Ortega y Gasset.
Oh, right. Yes.
Masses, right? Right.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
But I mean, he was not a very original. He was imitating the Germans, I think.
No, I understand that.
Yeah.
I know the problem. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any
So I don't know. Perhaps we should close the session here because
whatever we want, yeah.
no, I don't.
Yeah. Whatever people want. Any other thought? I mean, I really thank you. It's very thought-provoking, and we look forward to many more conversations about this, and especially
Yeah.
Peter raised the whole thing about charisma, and then also somewhat the choice of extremely brilliant intellectuals, but why they would choose, right, to be on the other side of history, right, in a way, in terms of the dominate. What is really going on there? Something that's perplexed me for a very long time. Yeah. Anyway, it's
Okay.
yeah. I mean, there's something that happens right in a moment. What is being seen? Is there some kind of mediocrity that's coming from below that they want to confront, right? They don't really understand the longer struggle. I mean, what is this kind of, as you phrased, Weber said, the excessive elitism
Yeah. In my view, Michael, all mediocrity, corruption, and all these things, they come from the top and they are promoted from the top.
Okay.
And again, this is not an original idea, but it's Machiavelli.
Yeah, no, I know.
Machiavelli is adamant that all corruption, and corruption for Machiavelli is inability for politics, ultimately, comes from the head and goes downwards to the members, he says. So yes, and well, we can see it. I mean, we can see the ruling class, the oligarchies, promoting all sorts of racism, xenophobia, hatred, etc., because this is the way they need to rule. So mediocrity is promoted from the top.
Right. So you see this as a Hobbesian principle of divide and conquer constantly, as always, already operative. Yeah.
Yes, it's at the heart of it as well. Yes. So yeah.
But maybe it's also like the mediocrity is also part of the kind of inner logic of capitalism, which is when the political is in such a crisis that it's foreclosed and over-dominated by just particular considerations, like the logic of capital is buying and selling, and you're going to get mediocrity because you're extrapolating a very simple practical logic of buy low and sell high, or in all of its manifestations, and you're extrapolating that as the definition of how you should live life as a human being. And you can only get mediocrity if you do that. I mean, in other words, we're we're living through almost like a crisis of the European Enlightenment. I mean, Kant's letter, What is Enlightenment, almost reads like the most radical, revolutionary idealism. It's almost unheard of. Because the more the capitalist class directly rules over the political, to the point where even classical liberalism is dead. In other words, like, what is the political? I think that's the really fundamental question today. Like the foreclosure of political ideas is probably the shortest way to summarize the reasons for mediocrity, in so-called politics, in everyday life, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we have phrases, as you know, in the tyranny of the majority, right?
Yeah.
The unwashed masses, right? There's many levels to this that go on in terms of the vernacular, et cetera. And, even-
I mean, I think part of this,
Go ahead,
I
yeah.
think part of this dominant liberal ideology is still, we can still read it. I remember recently I read Federalist number 10, because I was teaching American
Wow,
governors.
that's the worst one.
The worst one. And
That's the worst
in
one.
there, it says literally, it says, those with ownership of private property and wealth have to be in power because they are more intelligent. Because essentially, owning property, right, is a function of human intelligence. I mean, and it says the purpose of liberal society is to maintain the difference in intellect in society. I mean, it's like, that's the blueprint that we're still living
And
through.
that's the function of government, to
And that's the
protect
function
these
of government.
differential capacities in acquiring
Yeah.
wealth.
Yeah.
So who are
And
the clever ones? Oh, the rich. But obviously it's how you call it?
Right.
So in that sense, the police in America is functioning 100% okay, in line with its political mandate. It's the US Constitution. I mean, it's directing its violence against those in society who are judged to be by the powerful, to be the least intellectually formed. I mean, that's racist theory, right? Deployed, filtered through the Constitution, and then applied through the executive branch of the government. I mean, it's like it's functioning perfectly.
Hmm. Yeah.
But
yeah, Federalist number 10. Oh, I explain to students very often. Yeah, it's quite astonishing. Yeah. So shall we call it a day here, Michael?
Yeah, of course. I mean, whatever you like. And thank you again. And I'm going to need Peter.
I'm very happy to have done this.
Yes, no, we really enjoyed it, and we need to figure out, Peter, what do? I stop the recording and then
stop recording and then